The Sword of Laban being connected to Joseph of Egypt, possibly being made of meteorite iron, and a detailed description about the sword that's lesser known and often overlooked. We'll look at that and more today on the Relic Smith channel. Today's video basically relies on one person, someone by the name of Francis Gladden Bishop, and basically two accounts talking about the Sword of Laban, one of which linking it back to Joseph of Egypt, and another account describing in detail what he saw the Sword of Laban to be. Now, before we get into that, the question is, how trustworthy are these accounts? Historian Don Bradley believes a lot of his information came straight from Martin Harris. So whether some accounts may have been a little bit more embellished than others, there is reason to believe it is based on actual information passed down from Martin Harris. I would check out this video where he talks a little bit more about that. First account that we're going to look at, he says, talking about the Sword of Laban, the sword was made by Joseph, who was sold into Egypt for his posterity, and was preserved by the hand of the Lord until it came forth in the last days. Let's look at some of the plausibility of the Sword of Laban being linked back that far. First off, we know that Laban held the brass plates, which is hugely important, and it has basically the 5 books of Moses in it and some prophecies having to do with Joseph of Egypt. So that right there shows some connection to Joseph of Egypt. Now, if he was a keeper of the brass plates and he was a wealthy man and had ties to military leadership, it's quite plausible that he may in fact have other relics passed down from that long ago. Now let's look at the plausibility of Joseph in Egypt making a sword like this in the first place. Now, Joseph did end up being a very high-ranking official in Egypt, second only to the Pharaoh. So would he have the resources to build a very valued sword with a gold hilt and then have that passed down? That's very plausible. In Genesis, it does show that Joseph inherited some things from Pharaoh. We know in Egyptian culture, they have certain possessions that are prized and passed down and possessions that show a form of leadership. Genesis 41, Pharaoh elevates Joseph with a royal insignia, ring, fine linen, and a gold chain. In Egyptian coronations, viziers and generals often received a ceremonial sword. Usually this ceremonial sword was a khopesh. There are plenty of examples of Egyptian swords having gold hilts and even straight swords. It's plausible that Joseph could have owned a ceremonial sword or a sword that showed his authority. So this proves that gold-handled ceremonial swords existed precisely during and after Joseph's historical window. A vizier of Pharaoh's rank could absolutely commission a similar weapon. Now, likely it would be a bronze blade weapon with a gold hilt, but we'll talk a little bit more about that in just a moment. Now, the question of preserving that sword through multiple generations, over thousands of years, is that even plausible? Precious metal weapons were preserved and even ritually re-anointed across generations. We have examples of that. Archaeological hoards in Levant and Egypt show centuries of curation of ceremonial weapons. So a sword passed down from Joseph of Egypt and eventually into the hands of Laban is totally plausible. Now, the biggest conflict of this is Nephi describes the blade of the sword being steel. Could Joseph of Egypt made a very early form of steel and that was passed down? This is very unlikely. Way back during Joseph's time, there's no archaeological examples of that. Most weapons would be made of bronze. We do have an example of a very rare iron dagger way before the Iron Age, which is King Tut's meteor iron dagger around 1330 BC. So this demonstrates that Egyptians could work iron centuries before the Iron Age. Obviously, an object like this is very prestigious, being made of meteoric iron, which is very rare, and also very symbolic. It's not necessarily a military thing, and this example is just a dagger, not a full-on sword. Now this made me think of something very interesting, very unlikely. It's still not impossible. Joseph being second to only Pharaoh, he would obviously have resources to all kinds of Egyptian metallurgy. What if Joseph of Egypt had a sword commissioned and he had the blade made of meteor iron? Not only would this be a divine sword, what's more divine than metal from the sky? And that's what the Egyptians called it, this divine metal. Let's just take a look at what if. Joseph of Egypt, given his resources, we know that he prophesied and he saw the Exodus. Why wouldn't he be able to see one of his descendants, Joshua, leading that Exodus and leading the conquest and having a sword to be made to show lineage and authority to lead that conquest, using the most precious form of iron, which would be meteorite iron, like King Tut's dagger, having this passed down and preserved, eventually ending up in the hands of Laban. Nephi pulled it out. Maybe that's what he meant by most precious steel.
But I know what you're thinking.
Meteorite iron is not steel, it has no carbon in it. But there's no Hebrew word for steel. The word barzel, and I'm sure I'm not saying that right, meant iron. There was no word for steel. Now, steel in those days would basically mean a very refined iron. Possibly that could be describing a meteorite steel. Now, I know if I was Joseph and I foresaw my posterity and I wanted to create some type of symbol, and I had the ability to make a sword of meteor iron, that's what I would choose. It doesn't get more divine than that. Now, that theory is obviously very speculative and is quite a stretch, but it certainly would be interesting if Joseph had a sword made of meteor iron and passed that down to his generations. Now, the second option, him having a sword made out of the materials of the time, it would be a bronze sword and with a gold hilt. We have plenty of examples of that during the time. And then eventually, as it's passed down, in order to protect that relic, because it's a very important heirloom, the sword would then be repaired and reforged with an iron blade, maybe an early steel blade, in order to preserve it. And we do have examples as metallurgy advanced. Ancient elites often replaced blades while preserving decorated hilts. An archaeological parallel is the hybrid bronze iron weapons in the late bronze, early iron transitions from 1250 to 1100 BC. Now, albeit those are bronze transitioning to iron and not steel, given steel is not widespread during the Iron Age, and it's even not widespread during the time of Nephi. The now two swords from Ugarit, I'm not sure how to pronounce that, show Italian type bronze hilts mated to early iron blades. A few other examples. These finds confirm that reforging and blade replacement were known practices. So a Joseph era Bronze Age sword could have been refitted with a steel blade by Laban's time, matching Nephi's precious steel description. If the Sword of Laban traces its lineage all the way back to Joseph, why was it still referred to the Sword of Laban and not the Sword of Joseph or the Sword of the Conquest or something else? It's just the Sword of Laban. Perhaps it was just referred to the Sword of Laban because of reforging, drawing in that idea that, after the bronze blade was restored into a steel blade to preserve it, then it's kind of a new sword, so a new name of the person that reforged it or something like that. So the Sword of Laban. Or could it be historical memory loss? As it's passed down, its heritage is forgotten and we just know it by the current holder of the relic, Laban. So given all that, do you think the Sword of Laban goes back that far? Or do you think it's just something made at the time of Laban? It certainly uncovers some very interesting theories. Now, the second account from Francis Gladys Bishop is his description of the Sword of Laban, and that's exactly how I created this sword. Well, not exactly. There's a lot of inference because trying to figure out what he meant by his description when he describes the details is a mystery in itself. First, I'm going to read his full description, then I'm going to break it down how I interpreted to make this sword. The blade of this sword is somewhat dagger-shaped, broad at the hilt, having two sharp edges and terminating in a sharp point. It is about 3 feet in length and is fine polished steel. The hilt or handle is pure gold and 4 square, and opposite each square is a most beautiful guard of fine gold also. Each guard is composed of 3 bars, upon each of which is set a precious stone, making 12 in all, of various hues, the same kind as those 12 precious stones set in Aaron's breastplate. Upon the top of the hilt is fixed a gold cross, each end of which is joined to the top of the 4 guards respectively. And on the lower end of the hilt the 4 guards are joined in one piece, upon which is fixed a most beautiful pearl. When he describes the blade, he says, having 2 sharp edges and then terminating in a sharp point. It is about 3 feet in length. So that's pretty straightforward. Now the rest of the description gets a little bit more tricky. When he describes guards, he's not talking about guards in this sense, because this would be a sword far before its time. I interpret that when he says guard as being the parts of the hilt that protrude past the handle. When he talks about the top of the hilt, is he meaning this or here? Traditionally, this is always referred to as the top of the hilt. Most likely during that time, 1850s, when he says the top of the hilt, he wouldn't be making the mistake of describing this as the top of the hilt. So that is another strong reference point how to interpret this description. Then he says the hilt or handle is pure gold and 4 square. Is that a geometric pattern? Or is that simply the term implying the symmetry? There's 4 sides that are symmetrical. That's how I chose to interpret it. And opposite each square is a most beautiful guard of fine gold also. Each guard is composed of 3 bars, upon each of which is set a precious stone, making 12 in all. And then he referenced Aaron's breastplate. 12 of these stones on top of each of those bars. And if this description is true, this further ties a sword of this linked back to Joseph. Upon the top of the hilt is fixed a gold cross, each end of which is joined to the top of the 4 guards respectively. And on the lower end of the hilt, the 4 guards are joined in one piece. When I first read this, I interpreted it like a rapier sword with a basket case, because it starts at one end and then joins at the other. But that archaeologically wouldn't make any sense. It wouldn't fit any descriptions of the swords of the time. So instead, what I interpreted is those 4 guards, they run along the handle, terminating into one piece. So there it is. That's how I took that description and interpreted it and made something that looks somewhat Egyptian, somewhat Iron Age type sword with fine workmanship, something like that, and created this Sword of Laban. Does this interpretation match up with Bishop's description? Does it match up with the real ancient work and designs that we've looked at? Obviously, this reconstruction is speculative along with this theory, and it's all based on Francis Gladden Bishop's 1851 account combined with archaeological parallels. It's not doctrinal or proven, but an exploration of how such a description could possibly fit into ancient craftsmanship. For all we know, it could be a description that could be thrown out and have no validity to it. And the Sword of Laban, could maybe look more like this instead, but I thought it was still interesting nonetheless. How could that description possibly fit something that looks like an ancient sword? And what's the plausibility of the Sword of Laban possibly being linked back to the time of Joseph and him creating a sword and passed down and preserved through the generations, linking Joseph to Nephi? We know Nephi was descendant of Joseph. Then becomes not just any sword, but a sword of great importance, basically being that sign of authority and lineage. I want to hear your thoughts. Do you think the Sword of Laban is also the sword of Joseph? Do you think I did a pretty good job, or Do you have another idea of how that description could be interpreted? What do you think the Sword of Laban looked like? And if you missed the other video, be sure to watch that where I dive into more archaeology about the Sword of Laban.